Welcome to today's episode. Today, Michael, Mascha, and I want to talk about pleasure, what brings us pleasure, how water can be one of life's great pleasures, how this translates into sort of the epicurean world, the world of the sommelier. We're all familiar with wine sommeliers, but there's also a new and growing world, actually not very new, but growing world of water sommeliers who focus on all the different kinds of mineral waters out there. And then we also want to talk about how water combines with other things. So water and wine, water and coffee, water and chocolate, and this whole world of Epicurean world of water.
And yes, there is such a thing as a water sommelier. Many people still find it curious, but it's growing and it really has established itself. And it's part of the idea that water is not just for hydration. You've heard this many times before. The waters we're talking about experience. So it's the hydration and the experience. And if you have experiences or can have experience with something, you also need knowledge. And the water sommelier is the person that has that knowledge and can help you into the new world of fine waters and can also guide your experience. So when you talk about hydration, you talk about a necessity. You know, you're thirsty, you have to drink water. If you want to have an experience with water, there's pleasure comes in. And we all very much used to, conceiving food and sex as pleasures. And there's actually much more to just food and sex because there's some recent research and it expands the whole category, I think, which makes it very interesting for what we are trying to do here.
Yeah, so you had mentioned that there was a Danish study, some study that really looks at all of the different kinds of things that bring us pleasure. Can you tell us a little bit more about that study?
Yeah, it's really interesting because in addition to food and sex, it uses the company and variety as elements of having pleasure. And it totally makes sense because, if you take food, for example, if you only eat one kind of food and if you eat it always alone, you probably don't have much pleasure. Even the nicest food you have, if you eat it on a daily basis, you will have not so good experience with it. So, and you want to share it with people. So the idea that pleasure is food and sex and variety and company, I think really fits into our concept here very well. And of course, the sex part is a different show, but we want to focus on the food part here and how much the variety aspect and the company aspect comes into that. And if you think about wine, you don't drink wine to get drunk. You drink wine for the experience, for discovering new things, for the variety, for having many different wines, and also for the company. It's very sad if you drink all your wine alone at home. So you want to drink it with friends, with people. You want to have the company. You want to share. You want to explore. So I think this concept from Professor Kringelbach about expanding what pleasure is, I think it's a very valuable one. It gives us a very good insight.
And it reminds me of these dichotomies that we've been talking about throughout this series. We talk about water for hydration versus water for pleasure. And we talk about processed tap waters versus these natural mineral waters. So all of these kind of differences, what we do because we need to do it to survive versus what we do because if we're fortunate enough to have all the things that we need to survive, we can also then focus on kind of more refined pleasures and how as you said, how that variety can bring pleasure. So in previous episodes, we talked about how one of the problems that's often, we've often experienced with water is that if you go to a restaurant, there's generally, just a couple of choices if you want a bottled water. There's still or sparkling. That's often what will be offered to you without even giving you a label or a name. And so inevitably, if you end up having only Perrier, only San Pellegrino, right? Even if it's a delicious water that you might enjoy in different contexts, it becomes boring because there isn't that variety. It's no longer about exploring the nuances and trying to pick up on hints of different minerals, thinking about how that plays off the food. If you're always having the same water with every kind of food, you're no longer thinking about those relationships. And I think that that's really what this pleasure is about with water, is allowing yourself to really focus and pay attention to details, because it's a subtle love, right? That we've often talked about how water, it doesn't have the same robust flavor as a wine. It's not really meant to compete on the table with a wine in that way, but that does not mean it doesn't complement those flavors, or that the flavors of water can really play with the different flavors in your food, etc. as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned the still and sparkling choice. It's still one of my biggest regrets when I go to a restaurant, because at the same time, if I look at the wine list, there are 100 wines on the wine list. And imagine how boring a restaurant would be if you have a 5-course meal and the waiter asks you, do you want red or white with this one? And there's nothing wrong. We all know there are small restaurants that have red and white, but that's a different thing. In a restaurant, you have a wine sommelier making sure there's a selection of wine that gives you different experiences with the food, the pairings, the matchings, the contrastings, and he curates the wine selection. And if people ask, so what does a wine sommelier do? We all know what he does or she does, but a water sommelier does the same thing. He curates experiences for you in a restaurant, in a hospitality context with water. And he integrates it with the wine, he integrates it with the chef. And now still and sparkling is no longer a choice. Now you have what we call a water menu, which contains, depending on your restaurant, between 6 and 20, sometimes 30 waters. And now you can select from different waters and have beautiful epicurean experiences, not only with wine and food, but also with water and food and water and wine. So my good friend Martin Riese, famous water sommelier, who has really been pushing the envelope and started a water menu for a famous restaurant in Los Angeles a while ago. We have been working together for a long time, and we both of us have been approached many times saying, Michael, Martin, how can we learn about fine waters? How can we become a water sommelier? We would like to learn more. So about 2 years ago, or pretty much exactly 2 years ago, I just realized we launched it 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we launched the Fine Water Academy, where we put all our knowledge into an online course, allowing people to become water sommeliers. And it's not easy. It's a rather long course with lots of assignments and tests. And Elena was one of our candidates, and she graduated. She did it very fast. So what was your experience with the water sommelier course? Why did you come to it? And tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, I have an unusual history. I think I was a little concerned actually initially that I wouldn't be a good fit, because I wasn't in the wine business. I wasn't in the restaurant business. I didn't have a formal kind of foodie training, but I came at it from a more environmental perspective, as we've sort of been exploring a lot in this series. And I was exposed to this world of fine water when I ran a taste test experiment with my colleague. We were interested in the environmental impact of bottled water and whether students could discern the different flavors of different waters. And we had a different set of questions than a water sommelier would address, but we explored this whole world of fine water. And I realized, wow, this is this universe that I didn't even know, at that time I didn't know existed. And I was very curious about it. And I also was really wanting to understand the industry in a more detailed way. So one of the things that I've mentioned a number of times in this series is that when people talk about bottled water, especially in the environmental world, when people address questions about bottled water, that it all has the same face. So when you, as an environmentally sort of aware person, think of bottled water, you think of massive piles of empty, large, single-use plastic water bottles, right? Typically kind of processed waters or spring waters that are from multiple sources, aren't particularly special. So when I came into this, I wanted to understand, well, it seems to me, just from dabbling with this taste experiment, that there's more to this world than this pile of plastic bottles. So what is this world all about? And I had seen a video with Martin in it, and exploring his web presence, I found, and also, found the Fine Water Society as well, just from looking at what this fine water category was all about, and then bumped into this course, originally thinking I would just get brief training, maybe just take the little intro course, because there's different levels of training that you can opt to get with this, with the academy. And actually, Michael, you were the one who convinced me, no, I think you really need to go through the full course. And I thought, well, maybe I just want to have more information. But as you learned, I have a pretty insatiable curiosity about all this stuff. And I don't feel, even after a full year of doing almost nothing but water, I don't feel that I've really scratched more than just the surface. So it's a whole universe that I was able to explore in that course that I really, really appreciated.
I'm glad we have you, and I think these conversations we're having here, this series is already part of your contributions, coming from a different angle, but overlapping with what we're doing in the Fine Waters and Fine Water Academy. So a water sommelier is definitely epicurean. What does it mean? It means it's connected with food. Doesn't always mean you have to have food with your water, but it means paying attention to the water, considering water something special. And especially here in America, when people drink water, and even in advertising, you see them walking around on the street with a bottle of water and drinking water from a plastic bottle. I don't consider this to be Epicurean. This is the hydration aspect. It's much more like in Europe. You have this in France, in Portugal, in Austria, everywhere. When you're thirsty, you sit down at a table and you order maybe a coffee and you order a bottle of water. You sit down, you relax, you breathe, and you take a couple of sips of water, maybe with a friend, and talk a little bit. So it's a totally different integration. So a water sommelier is not so much for the people on the run drinking from the bottle while they're walking, but if you put it on a table, so to speak. And the table can have many different tables, could be a coffee table, or it could be, in most cases, the restaurant table. And suddenly there's a second bottle on the table, which means we need to pay attention now also to the second bottle, and the second bottle being water usually doesn't have an etiquette associated with it. You get the wrong glass, you get a plastic glass, you get a glass without a stem. People put the water at the wrong temperature. So what a water sommelier does, and what we educating the people, there's a bottled water etiquette. Water should be consumed at the proper temperature, not too cold. If you take it out of the freezer, you don't taste anything. Don't put ice cubes in your water. The ice cubes dilute the water. Maybe the ice cubes have been made with tap water that's chlorinated. Your nice water is destroyed with the ice cubes. Have a nice glass with the water so you can celebrate. Don't use a tumbler while other people in the wine classes have the nice stems. So elevating this whole experience of drinking water with a bottled water etiquette. And what you also discover then is water can taste very, very different. We'll do a water tasting in one of the following episodes, and you will see how very, very different water can taste. It's something that sounds strange if you have never done it. Anytime you do it, you will immediately discover how different water is. And now the water sommelier can use the different flavors of water to enhance, contrast, match food together with the chef. Absolutely fantastic experiences can be had by matching water with different food. So this is kind of what a water sommelier does, educating the consumer, elevating the category, and creating new experiences for the people in a restaurant.
I think another important role that the water sommelier has is to really be aware of the sorry about that, this is real life here. That another role that they have is to really talk about that origin story, right? To really know their brands, know the people who are producing those waters. Sometimes in your case, you're in Martin's case, you know these producers personally, right? Like you've talked to them, you've interviewed them, you've had all kinds of interactions with these people, and you have sometimes actually worked to develop their business models, right? So there's all kinds of layers to what you do. But the important thing is to remember, you mentioned in a previous episode the importance of terroir, and you argued that terroir is actually arguably more important in a water than a wine because you have sometimes many, many layers of earth, right, that are going to influence the flavors and add minerals to the water over sometimes thousands of years, etc. So I guess I just wanted to add this other piece to it, which is, and this may be true of a wine sommelier, right? If you may have a really intimate relationship with different producers, but I think with the water world, that's even more the case or more important. This awareness of who these people are who are producing these products, and the origin stories of those waters.
Yeah, absolutely. Stories are really important. I have a lot of good friends in the wine industry. I'm actually part owner of a wine store. Believe it or not, I don't drink wine, but I'm part owner in a wine store in Los Angeles. So the story is really important. What the sommeliers, the wine sommeliers very early on told me, if you're a good wine sommelier, you're actually not selling the wine, you're selling the story. And the wine is the vector for the story to travel across. And we have the same thing with water. A good water sommelier sells the story exactly as Elena was saying. He has a relationship. He knows where the water is coming from. He can tell you the origin story. He can tell you something about the people. How did this water came to play? It makes it such an interesting part, and it can stand at the same level as wine. Our stories are as good as the wine stories. So the story aspect is, again, very, very important because it really influences everything you experience is if you know where it's coming from. So this whole idea that many of the waters we're talking here about come from this, what we call small water farmers, from the people who are really dedicated to their environment, very passionate, and bottling the water at the source as gentle as possible to give you the experience in the restaurant that you drink the water at the source. This emotional connection back to the water, I think, works beautifully in water as well as it does in wine.
So one question I have, I was thinking about this whole pathway to becoming a sommelier and getting to know these different producers, etc. There's your academy. That's kind of the world that I got to know this whole world through you and Martin. But until you opened the academy, what other options are there for people, or have there been for people who wanted to explore this kind of on a professional level?
It's the water sommelier is a fairly recent development. I would say within the last 5-6 years or so, and people approach it from two different sides. So Martin and I approached it from water. We have been in the water industry for almost 20 years, and lots of experience. We work in the industry, and we only work with water. So we wanted to share our knowledge with water. So this is our approach. We come from the water world. And you see a couple of institutions and academies that come from the wine world. They have wine sommelier training, and they discovered that water is becoming a thing now, and they added water sommelier courses based on the experience and on the knowledge they had with wine. So it was added on. So those are the two different approaches, obviously. And I would say we have maybe 3 or 4 other places where it can be a water sommelier. Very big in South Korea, in Germany, and in Italy. There are some courses in becoming a water sommelier, but it's usually an add-on to a wine sommelier. And while we are a little bit more of a freestanding coming directly from the category kind of course.
And so then the other question I have, which I don't, I'm not meaning to turn this into a Q&A, but is, do you know worldwide now how many certified water sommeliers there are? Like, I would imagine that, as you said, it's a recent phenomenon. The last several years, I know Martin was one of the very early ones who went through the German mineral and spirits. I can't remember which association he went through in Germany to get his certification. But are there, do you have any sense of the numbers there? Who's working on things?
So I would think it's in the hundreds. So maybe 2 to 3. I think on the outside 400. I think many of them in South Korea, they're graduating water sommeliers there on a very rapid basis. Again, in addition with food service education and wine sommelier education. So it's this kind of add-on. But the freestanding water sommelier, I would say in the hundreds. I also want to mention that I don't think, as a wine sommelier, it's a job, right? You're a wine sommelier, you work for a restaurant, this is your job. This is what you do. I think the water sommelier is slightly different. I don't think it's a dedicated job. In many instances, I think it's an add-on to an existing education or passion in the food industry or in other industries. What we see right now is a lot of maitre d's, a lot of wine sommeliers adding the water sommelier certification. And we also, I'm very happy about that. We see a lot of brands, water brands, small water brands that want to have the knowledge and adding on a wine sommelier to their brand experience. So if you talk to someone at the brand, you talk to someone who knows what they're talking about. And I find it fascinating that we have now many small brands that have a water sommelier. And you talk to the big brands. You talk to people from San Pellegrino, Panna, people from Danone, Evian, Ferrarella, and all the big waters. And they don't have water sommeliers. They don't have water sommeliers. So I find it absolutely fascinating because it would be very hard to imagine that there is a wine company out there that doesn't have a wine sommelier. Every winemaker is a wine sommelier or has a wine sommelier. So I find it really strange that this is not happening, but maybe we're ahead of the curves, and the small producers just have more passion for the category and what they want to do than the larger corporations, which are a little bit more focused on the spreadsheets, as we talked before in another episode.
It's clear that I think that idea of being ahead of the curve is correct, and that this is something that the fact that these giant companies don't just automatically have experts in water suggests that priority is really recent, right? That if there isn't a demand for that, or the clients don't automatically expect that kind of information or that kind of expertise, then this means this is something that's really developing. So you've been kind of, I think your story is really cool too, because you're somebody who came from that wine loving world. You understood the kind of love of variety and terroir and story and all the things that went into your passion for wine, and then you were unable to drink alcohol, right? So you switched your focus to something that people hadn't really considered to have those qualities, right? Which is honestly, from my perspective now, kind of astonishing. But this is where you certainly were coming from at a time, even earlier time, right, where there wasn't any academy for someone like me to just drop into and learn about this stuff. And building this epicurean context around water in a way that people really hadn't been appreciating. So I think part of my motivation for doing this series is recognizing this trajectory, seeing the way in which water is becoming this other category in the sort of food and pleasure world, but not wanting it to kind of climb to that place without really considering the environmental context, which has been such a trigger, such an important kind of topic for people interested in sustainability in the environment. So I think that these two realms really are very compatible, and I think that they need to move together, because I think that this world of water is these are perfect spokespeople for the environment, I think. And that anytime you have a new realm, anytime you have a new way of thinking about things, and I think 10 years is pretty new, right? Then it's important to consider the life that will take on, and the direction it will go, and make sure that you're paying attention to all the other pieces. So I think it's really exciting to be kind of on the cusp of something new and building and developing.
Yeah, it's very rewarding right now. 15 years ago, less so, because this was a crazy idea and everyone tried to prove that it's a crazy idea. Yeah, but I think what you said was really important. One of the focuses was the passion, and I had the passion for the wine. And now that the wine was removed, I still had my passion. I just had to find something else to be passionate about. And when I come back to this, passion is really at the center for me, is passion for something. And when I come back to the small companies having water sommeliers and the large companies don't have water sommeliers. So the small companies hire or put effort into having a water sommelier because they're passionate about the water. This is their product, right? I'm pretty sure the big companies also hiring people, but they probably hiring spreadsheet experts, marketing people. They're hiring data mining people that can really drill down. They're hiring a large advertising agency. So they're also spending money on selling their product, but their product doesn't have the passion, doesn't carry the passion so much. It's more the spreadsheet type of things, increasing market shares and distribution. So I think that's the big difference. And when we talk about the large companies and the small companies, I think this is the big difference. We need to be careful. This is not either or, this is a continuum. So there are some, as we mentioned, large companies that are very, very passionate about, and they have water sommeliers on board. The leading company in Portugal, Pedro's Waters, has a water sommelier on board. So they understand that they need to talk from a different, and he's also a geologist. So they're really passionate about that. So you can see that, but there's some really, really large companies that just don't care about it anymore. At some point they will, and let's see what happens then. So I think the water sommeliers are really on the forefront of creating what Martin and I have started, and putting this into many, many different places in a very professional way, but also in a very fun way. We all remember the wine sommeliers from the 80s. There are many movies about that, when basically the goal of the wine sommelier was to embarrass you in front of your guests in the restaurant, letting you know how little you know about the wine and how wrong your wine choice was. So this kind of is over. It's over in the wine world, but we never had that aspect. So Martin and I are very much into having fun, sharing joy with the water, and making it accessible. It's not something where you have to study 10 years before you become an expert. No, just go there, drink 3 different waters. We tell you a little bit, and you know much more about water, and you have had a great experience with the water. So I think that's what the water sommelier does. But if you look deeper, there are many other aspects where water is important in this Epicurean world.
Yeah, before we transition to the ways in which water is used in food and coffee and chocolate and all these things, I think this is actually a really important point that I wanted to reiterate, which is that wine and water are different in part because water has such a complex, there's so many pieces to the water puzzle, right? There's the fine water Epicurean piece of it, but there's also the hydration, also the access to clean water, health, safety, right? There's so many pieces to this water puzzle, which is why we needed an entire series to explore it, which wine doesn't have. So there was a time in history when wine was used for hydration, right? That maybe people didn't have access to clean water, so they drank alcohol. That was typically how wine's history sort of developed, right? That there was this need for alcohol to help kill those bacteria and other things. People at least understood that when they drank wine, they got less sick than when they were drinking some of their local water. But now we certainly don't see wine as, okay, well, there's the wine you just have to have every day. And then there's this fine wine world, right? Typically, yes, there are still people who buy the giant boxes of wine that are cheap and, you know, not very special. But then that's more about getting drunk with your friends, or maybe you don't care that much about the flavor, but it's about partying, or there's some other piece to that puzzle. But water is so essential to us that it's a more nuanced topic. And this is just one piece of that, right? This Epicurean world we're talking about. So with that, like, yes, I think that what's one piece of that puzzle, or an additional piece, is how does water interact with other things like wine, like chocolate, like coffee.
Yeah, you made a really, really good point. Again, it's complicated, but I always say that wine has much more data points. If people say, you know, how to match all those things, you know, wine has much more data point. It has a color, it has a smell, and it has characteristic tastes. If you look at water, usually it doesn't have a smell unless you go into very high TDS waters with sulfur. The water doesn't have a color, hopefully. It doesn't have a color. And if it does, you know, don't drink it. And it doesn't have such a strong taste. So much more data points with wine. But you made a really good point. I never thought about this. The data points in this integration into the society are much, much more complex with water for exactly the reasons you mentioned before versus with wine. We all, if you say wine, we know exactly what it is, you know, the get drunk or enjoy part, but it's on a continuum. It doesn't have that complexity in so many aspects as water does. I think this is a really, really good point. We should, you know, elaborate in the future.
So maybe we can ask now what, you know, in the next couple of minutes that we have left on this, what are some ways in which water and these other foods, other liquids, how do they interact? So I know this is a big part of the course that you teach with Martin, but what are some of the big things that people are thinking about with these interactions?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And we started with water. You know, this was water drinking. And suddenly you look at a cocktail and you look at a classic martini cocktail, and there's a significant amount of water in the cocktail. So we said, hey, does the difference in water that we perceive when drinking, what happens if you make ice? And of course, you discovered that if you use chunk ice or chlorinated tap water ice, it has a total different experience with the martini cocktail than if you use ice from a real source, you know, low mineral content water. And we made tests and had a mixologist making different ices, even different sizes of ices, and make cocktails with it. You have 3 different cocktails, different waters, different ice size, huge difference. So this kind of, the cocktail was the thing that opened up the world. Then we think, of course, what about tea and coffee? Significant amount of water is in your tea and your coffee. It's basically all water. We engaged with tea sommeliers, did a lot of testing, found out how huge difference it makes which water you use with tea. It's unbelievable, the difference. And I was reminded by a Chinese friend that in China, many teas, you know, are called not from the place where they come from, but from the water source they're used for brewing the teas. So this tea-water connection, if you go to Japan, very, very deep routes, we just didn't think about so much. Then we discovered the same thing is true with coffee. Huge differences with the coffee. We briefly talked about Rome and the different aqueducts, where certain areas have a different roast that especially match to the water. Makes a huge difference with coffee. I just recently was in Panama, where we had some geisha coffee, which is a very, very high-end coffee. And again, they recommend a particular water from their region, low mineral content, Bambito, and the two things work perfectly together. If you make the same coffee with your tap water, you have something totally different. The latest thing where we discovered, we didn't think about it. We discovered where there's a significant amount of water, and actually Martin discovered this, was sorbets. So not the ice cream, but a sorbet. Sorbets are made with a significant amount of water. So Martin takes, I think, 6 different waters from low to high to a company that makes sorbets, and they make a lemon sorbet. Everything is the same, except the water is different. The outcome, we put some links below that. It's unbelievable. Totally different taste and totally different color and structure of the sorbet. Martin was saying one who has more crystals, the other ones felt more smoother. I haven't tasted it, but just from looking at the picture, you're looking at 6 different products, and the only difference is the water. So really, really important where water is and how it's integrated in the rest of it. And we should pay attention to that as well.
And none of this should really surprise us, right? Like, given that we've, in the series, in our training, have been exploring all of the things that can be in your water, right? That water is this universal absorber of, binds to so many different things, that we shouldn't be surprised, right? That when we have lots of different minerals that can be interacting, can be present, not present, that you can have a TDS, total dissolved solids from 0 all the way up to many, many thousands of milligrams per liter, that we should expect these to have big impacts on flavor. Even before this was kind of trendy, I remember I did my PhD at UC Davis in the Central Valley, and the tap water in Davis is very salty and pretty much undrinkable. You typically get, at least at the time, again, this may have changed now, but you would get your water in these big carboys from the supermarket, water that had been filtered so that didn't have those strong flavors. But I had a friend who loved tea, and she would only use the Davis tap water for her tea because it was this salty water to drink, but it was a delicious water with certain kinds of tea, right? So here's a person who, she was adamant about that, made delicious tea, right? So none of this should surprise us. And again, I think this is evidence that we're at the cusp of something, that if something that seems so evident to us is something that people aren't exploring as much in their own cooking and drinking, this says there's room for that growth. There's pushback, right? This is, again, back to this whole water is symbolic of so many other things issue that we've talked about. When restaurants in France have decided to use different kinds of mineral waters in their cooking, there's some pushback from people that say, oh, that's wasting water, you're contributing to the environmental problem, right? So everything is about balance, about making these choices. But part of the pushback, I think, comes from a lack of understanding that these flavors can be really significant, right? That the way that water interacts with what we eat and drink can be, really profound.
Yeah, I wrote it down what you just said, water is symbolic for so many things, and it's fascinating, and it's a really good comment. I just want to mention, exactly as you mentioned with the tea at UC Davis. I never lived in New York, but I lived in Los Angeles for a long time. And you meet someone from New York, you bring some bagels in the morning to a meeting, and you say, oh, it's a nice bagel, but it doesn't taste as good as a New York bagel. I think you guys are crazy. This is a bagel. It's probably the same thing. What's the difference in a bagel? This was a long time ago. And then I started realizing people use the same thing for pizza. Oh, New York pizza, the pizza dough is so much better. And then if you look at it, and I could imagine that the water has a lot to do with it, because New York in many places has a really good tap water from the Catskills. Los Angeles doesn't have a good tap water. If you make a dough, if you bake or make a pizza, there's some water in there. If you have a good water, that might influence it. My wife is a very good baker, and if she does some delicate things, she asks me for water from my collection here. She says, because I don't want to use just the regular water, reverse osmosis water that we're having, because we cannot drink our tap water here. So water influences a lot of things also in the cooking aspect, the baking, the pizza, the bagels, and there are many recipes that ask for special water. The classic one is the French Vichy carrots, where you have water cooked in carrots with a very high TDS water, and the high minerals, give together with the carrots make a very special dish. So not only in the things we consume, but also in the things that a chef uses for cooking, the water is very important. I briefly want to mention one more thing, because we talked about water, food and pairing. We will talk a little bit when we do the water tasting about the pairings and the matching of the water. But what I've done sometimes, and Martin the same, is we do 5, 6, 8 course food pairing dinners where we don't pair only wine or only wine and water, but we use just water. So we do a pairing between food and water. And it's really, really fascinating because people have a totally different experience with the food. Wine has a very strong flavor. It sometimes, even if the sommelier matches it carefully, it's something very strong next to the food. If for the whole evening you have that level reduced and you only have water with your food tastes different. I had so many people afterwards come to me and said, Michael, I've eaten it many times. I've never really experienced the flavors like this. And chefs come to us and tell us, this is the best thing for us. If people with my food don't drink wine, but only drink water, because my food even comes out much, much stronger and tastes different if you don't have the strong thing of wine next to it. So it's another aspect where I think the water can really be nicely integrated into an Epicurean context.
Well, and a final point, I think, I guess 2 small points is one, there's also no alcohol in water, right? And alcohol can impact your senses and your ability to distinguish different flavors, and it can be delicious, but it can also, even if you don't have a medical reason why you can't drink it, it can impact how you experience your emotions, your evening, your food. And then the other piece of it is, of this sort of puzzle that I wanted to mention, is the price. That water is much cheaper typically than a fine water is not, with some exceptions, going to be as expensive as a fine wine. And so it also opens up a world of kind of Epicurean enjoyment without a really prohibitive price tag for people who may not be able to afford to explore wine in that sophisticated way.
Yeah, very good point. I like your point about the alcohol, and it's really true. So last year in Stockholm, we had a big event, about 80 people in a restaurant, 5, 6 fantastic Northern cuisine courses, and just water served. And I could see it in the faces of the people when I told them at the introduction, there will be no wine for your dinner. People were like, oh my God, that's going to be terrible. And in the middle of the dinner, I stood up and took a picture and a small video. The whole room was buzzing. There was no difference to a room where you would have served wine. You have this, you go to a restaurant and people are talking, there's this buzz, and you think it has something to do, everyone is a little bit drunk and they talk more. It was exactly the same thing. So alcohol is nice, but as Elena was saying, it can take away a little bit from your experience because you're numbing some of your senses with the alcohol. It can have a pleasureful aspect, but it numbs some of your senses. They're not as sharp anymore. And you really don't need it, the alcohol, to have that experience. You can do it with water. I've seen it.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's something that I've definitely noticed in my new exploration of water. I have a harder and harder time being able to drink alcohol. I find it really difficult now to have more than a glass of wine, etc. I think as we change in age, our bodies, also change. And one thing that I just love about water is that I don't have to worry about that interaction, right? Like, it just allows me to experience it without thinking of how my brain chemistry is going to be altered from this experience, or am I going to be able to drive, or how am I going to feel the next morning, etc. So there's also a joy in being able to experience a really healthy substance that doesn't distract you from those different flavors because of the alcoholic component.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's kind of staying sharp, right? You do something where the chef has put a lot of effort into it, and you want to stay as sharp as possible to experience it, not have your 8 course after 8 glasses of wine. Well, you are probably significantly impacted. And I know what I'm talking about. So I would like to redo all the dinners I had with wine now, just drinking water and having more of the food experience.
Yeah, exactly. So we can, and that, I just feel like it's the next chapter of my life, right? Like, okay, fine. If I can't handle wine so much anymore, well, then let me prioritize the water on my table, and I can try to get everybody in my family excited about this as well. I even have my 6 and 8-year-old sampling waters. I have some funny videos of them sort of making funny faces, and when they taste something with really high salt content, they go, what is this? Or the bubbles that are surprising to them. So it's a really fun, it's also a really fun interactive experience. I've done water tastings at my work with my colleagues, and again, people walking in knowing nothing at all and walking out being like, wow, this is really interesting, this is really cool. So there's a lot of, when you're dealing with something that isn't universally well understood or well known, it doesn't have the same weight that a wine sommelier has, in the sense that people are like, oh, your wines, it's very sophisticated. Like, people are like, wait, you're what? You're an expert in water? Like, I don't know about that. So there isn't the same understanding of kind of what that world signifies. But I think once you open that door with people, everybody I know has been really curious and interested and sort of enthusiastic about learning more. So I don't know, if anything at all, it's a fun world to explore. And if you do so responsibly, I think we've argued in this series that it doesn't need to be some enormous environmental problem, right? That you may contribute to it slightly, as we do in everything that we do, but it doesn't need to signify an evil choice or something that you shouldn't be proud of, etc.
Yeah, very good point. And so hopefully what we have shown you today with the water sommelier course is that there is usually a second bottle on the table, next to the wine, it's the water bottle, but it doesn't have to be the second bottle. It can become the first bottle, and you can have very similar experiences. And we would argue that some of the experiences you have with water are sharper and maybe give you more pleasure than the experiences with wine when you drive home and have a hangover the next day. No such thing with water.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great endpoint. Actually, let's celebrate with water, and let's open up these new experiences to people. And next time we'll actually be tasting some of these waters, and we can chat about kind of how we're experiencing them. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye.